Wes Streeting is Shadow Health Secretary and tipped to be next Labour leader. But this weekend he gave an interview to the Sunday Telegraph and used it to attack the BMA, that's the union that represents doctors. The article quotes Streeting saying this: "Given that we have committed to more staff, I cannot for the life of me understand why the BMA is so hostile to the idea that with more staff must come better standards for patients," says Streeting. "Whenever I point out the appalling state of access to primary care, where currently a record 2 million people are waiting more than a month to see a GP, I am treated like some sort of heretic by the BMA, who seem to think any criticism of patient access to primary care is somehow an attack on GPs. Their defensive attitudes are maddening," he continues. "If anyone in the NHS thinks that they can demand more investment without demonstrating better standards for patients, they've got another thing coming. We are not going to have a something-for-nothing culture in the NHS with Labour." Now, I mean, the idea that there is a something-for-nothing culture in the NHS will probably be news to all the people, working loads of overtime for no pay and, struggling to treat everyone they want to treat because the service is underfunded and understaffed, but there we are. Let's go to Streeting. He elaborated on that interview on Sky News.
As for the BMA, I was just responding in that interview with The Telegraph to criticism they levelled at me, because despite the fact that I announced the biggest expansion of NHS staff in history, because I had the temerity to say that we should also expect better service for patients in exchange for that investment, because I think that it's unacceptable that people have to wait on the phone at 8 o'clock in the morning to get through to GP. I have been treated like some kind of heretic by the BMA, and I'm afraid, I do understand the pressure that doctors are under. They do a very difficult job against very difficult backdrop, but what I'm saying is, if we're putting investment into the NHS, as the next Labour government will, we have got to expect better results for patients. And ultimately, it's my job to be the patient's champion.
I mean, you would assume that everyone thinks if you give the NHS more money, there will be a better deal for patients, because a big problem the NHS have is that it's been underfunded. Anyway, especially, given Labour's promise to provide record numbers of new doctors, good promise, that will only be fulfilled in about 10 years' time. Criticising patient care when there aren't enough doctors does sound a bit like it's aimed at GPs. Dr. Emma Runswick is Deputy Chair at the BMA. Sky News asked her about the Streeting interview.
We just spoke to Wes Streeting there, Shadow Health Minister. He says he's not afraid to take you on. He calls you vested interests and says that you think he's a heretic for wanting better patient access. Are you concerned that you perhaps don't have as good a relationship as you should with the man who may well be Health Secretary very soon?
Well, certainly I'm disappointed in the rhetoric that Mr. Streeting is adopting.
He said he was replying to charges that you'd made against him.
Well, this morning he's said in the Telegraph that NHS staff are looking for something for nothing. And I think my members and many health staff across the UK will be absolutely gobsmacked by that, because we are giving everything and receiving less than nothing in return, pay cuts, real terms pay cuts in return. And we agree that we want a better health service. We're working in it. I see patients, every week who have been waiting for a long time to see us. And it's really devastating working in that situation where we know we're not providing the standards of care that we want to be. The solution isn't to attack the staff. The solution is to attack the government, who are absolutely responsible for driving our service into the ground with underfunding and staffing.
It wasn't just GPs that Streeting was critical of, though. It seemed to be the NHS as a whole. And his solution: get the private sector even more involved than it already is. Here's what he said to Sky News.
You've just referred to using the private sector more. Some would be astonished at seeing this policy coming from a Labour politician. You've also talked about the BMA, who we are going to be talking to later on in the programme, as vested interests. You say that they see you as a heretic for wanting better patient access, and you're going to take them on. How do you think these lines will go down with traditional Labour voters?
Well, the last Labour government successfully used the private sector to bring down NHS waiting lists. And, by the end of that Labour government, use of the private sector had fallen dramatically because the NHS was so good that people didn't feel the need to go private any longer. And as for the question of values, I think it's outrageous we've got a two-tier healthcare system in this country today, where those who can pay to go private do, and those who can't afford to go private are left behind. Or indeed, there are some people that are scrimping and scraping even getting themselves into debt in order to get seen faster. That's not a fair and equitable situation. That's not the NHS living up to its founding principles. And I think it's the right thing to do to create a level playing field using empty beds in the private sector so that people can be seen faster.
So Streeting claims that the last Labour government initially increased private spending in the NHS when it took power, and he implies that this was a successful strategy and that private sector involvement eventually dropped because the NHS was operating so much better by the end. That claim seems questionable, though. This graph from Full Fact shows that NHS spending on private providers went up in the last 5 years of New Labour and continued to rise at about the same rate under the Tories until 2013, when it dramatically shot up. Now, unfortunately, we can't go earlier than that because the figures don't exist. But maybe he can show us figures that showed us that it went dramatically down before 2006, but it doesn't look like it was a consistent decline of the use of the private sector. It's not the first time that Streeting has called for greater involvement of the private sector in the NHS either. So in an LBC interview last month, he said this.
What I've said to the NHS is I recognise that there isn't an answer to the immediate crisis, which doesn't require more investment, which is why we've committed to the workforce investment. But I've also been honest in saying that if the answer in this century is always more taxpayers' money into a 20th century model of care, there isn't going to be an NHS in the long term. So that's why, if we're elected at the next election, Labour's job will be to grip the immediate crisis, but also to make the right long-term decisions so we've got an NHS fit for the future.
Streeting also wrote this in The Guardian earlier this month. He says, I don't want working class people in pain, so I'd use private hospitals to bolster the NHS. So Streeting seems pretty keen on handing public money to private health firms, and it's worth noting that he's taken money from people with an interest in that project. One of those is hedge fund manager John Armitage. He used to give money to the Tories, but in January 2022, he gave £15,000 to Streeting to pay for his staff and office. His firm, Egerton Capital, owns more than $500 million worth of shares in United Health. That's one of the largest private health insurers in the United States. And a year ago, Streeting received £5,000 also for office costs from Lord Jonathan Mendelsohn. So at the time, he was involved in a private healthcare company called Europa Healthcare Limited, previously known as Europa Hospitals Limited. If you were to have suspicions about someone arguing that we should be using more of the private sector, if you think they're not necessarily being honest when it comes to what the NHS actually needs, then the fact that you're funded by people with an interest in private healthcare, that's not going to allay those suspicions, is it?
The Labour right, either by accident or by design, are quite incapable of pushing back against right-wing narrative making about the NHS. Because one of the things that we've discussed on this show is that an NHS staffing crisis, an NHS beds crisis, an NHS waiting list crisis isn't necessarily a terrible thing for a Conservative government if you've got a media and a think tank ecology which is hell-bent on saying that this is a result of NHS mismanagement. This is the result of inefficiencies in the public sector. And if only they learned more from private enterprise, or if there was an expanded role for private healthcare providers in the NHS, then you wouldn't see these things happening. Now, this is exactly the kind of narrative that you're seeing coming from think tanks like Policy Exchange, like the Institute for Economic Affairs, like the Taxpayers Alliance. And what you need is a Labour Party and a liberal and left-wing section of the media going, no, actually, this is just a direct result of the reforms which were implemented by successive Conservative governments, the fact that you took a load of money out of the NHS, the fact that you made working conditions worse for clinicians, the fact that you gutted admin capacity, the fact that real wages haven't kept up with the cost of living, and so on and so forth, right? You go all these things that patients are experiencing, that the public are experiencing as a consequence of these policies. Now, rather than doing that, I think what Wes Streeting is doing is he's going, okay, well, one of the things that we're getting back from focus groups is that lots of people have had some really negative experiences of the NHS. Now, that might be as a patient themselves struggling to get an appointment, or there were problems with the quality of care that you received, or it might be as, somebody who is trying to get one of their relatives access to the care that they need because of those, pressures on beds, because of the staffing exodus from the NHS, and also because of, the waiting list. You do have lots of people who have some really negative experiences of NHS treatment. Now, I don't think that there's, a particularly complicated reason for that. And I don't think it's because nurses and doctors and radiographers and, receptionists at GP practices are bad people. I think that it's because they're having to do an awful lot more with less. The something for nothing culture has come from 12 years of Tory governance. Now, that should be a really easy line for any Labour Shadow Health Secretary to stick. You just go, look, it's not rocket science. What the NHS needs is more money. We're going to give it to them, and we're going to do it, paying for it in these ways, and you're going to see standards improve. I promise you standards are going to improve if we give them more money. And I think it's a really simple line. But instead of doing that, I think because what Labour want to do is look like they're slaying the sacred cows of the left. They think that that's what adds up to being a sensible government in waiting, that they're instead effectively attacking doctors and attacking the BMA. So I think that it's on the basis of untruths. And I also think that it's strategically quite I don't think it's smart to reinforce lies which have come from your political opponents.